Ethan Carter slammed the eviction notice onto the kitchen table so hard that both his daughters flinched. 7-year-old Sophia looked up from her cereal. 5-year-old Chloe stopped breathing. He had 30 days. 30 days to find money he didn't have in a city that had already taken everything from him. That same afternoon, a woman in a wheelchair rolled into the cafe where he worked and recognized his face. She said 4 words that would change his life forever. "I need a husband." If you're watching this from Dallas, from Phoenix, from somewhere quiet, where you know what it means to carry a family on your back alone, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it moves you, subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next. The notice had been sitting in the mailbox for 2 days. Ethan knew what it was the moment he saw the yellow envelope with the property management company's logo in the corner. He'd been expecting it the way a man expects a punch he sees coming, but can't dodge the knowing doesn't make it hurt less. He'd just kept walking past it head down, telling himself he'd deal with it tomorrow. Then tomorrow came and went. Then it came again. On the 3rd morning, Sophia pulled it out of the mailbox herself. "Daddy," she said, holding it up with both hands, the way kids hold things they sense are important. "This has our name on it." He took it from her without a word. He put it in his jacket pocket. He made the girls' breakfast scrambled eggs, the last of the bread toasted just the way Chloe liked it, slightly burnt on the edges. He packed their backpacks. He walked them to the corner and waited until the school bus swallowed them whole and the doors folded shut. Then he went back inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and opened it. Notice of eviction. 30 days to vacate. He read it 3 times. Not because he didn't understand it the first time, but because some part of him kept hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something else. They didn't. Ethan Carter was 34 years old, and he was losing. Not the spectacular kind of losing that makes for good stories later. The slow, grinding, invisible kind. The kind where you wake up every morning and do everything right, and still end up further behind than the day before. He worked the morning shift at Harlow's Cafe, a small place 2 blocks from Pike Place Market, the kind of spot that smelled like roasted beans and old wood, and felt like it hadn't changed since 1987. He made decent tips on good days. On bad days, he made enough to cover the bus fare home. Before the cafe, he'd been in logistics management. A real job, benefits, a salary with 2 commas in it. He'd built something not wealthy but stable. The kind of stable that lets you breathe. Then his wife Diane got sick. She fought for 14 months. Ethan fought with her, beside her, behind her, in front of her, every way a man can fight a battle that isn't his to fight. He used the savings first. Then the retirement account. Then the credit cards. Then he borrowed from his brother, and then from Diane's parents, and then from a bank that charged him an interest rate he hadn't read carefully enough. When Diane died on a Tuesday morning in March 18 months ago, Ethan was left with 2 daughters, a mountain of medical debt, and a career gap on his resume that nobody in Seattle seemed willing to look past. So he took the cafe job, because it was there, because it paid, because it got him out of bed in the morning when nothing else could. He never once complained about it, not out loud, not where the girls could hear. "Mr. Carter." His manager Dale found him in the back room on his break, staring at his phone like it owed him something. "You doing okay?" "Fine," Ethan said. The word came out flat and automatic the way it always did. Dale was a good man. 50-something, thick arms, the kind of guy who coached Little League on weekends and remembered every regular customer's order by heart. He'd hired Ethan without hesitation, which Ethan had never forgotten. "Heard you on the phone earlier," Dale said carefully. "With the landlord." Ethan looked up. "Walls are thin," Dale said. He didn't apologize for it, just stated the fact. "I've got 30 days, Ethan said, to find a new place. To find a new place, the deposit first and last month, and somehow explain to 2 little girls why we're moving again." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Second time in a year." Dale was quiet for a moment. Then, "You need an advance." "I need a miracle," Ethan said. And then, because Dale's face went serious, he added quickly, "I'm fine, Dale. I'll figure it out. I always do." That last part wasn't entirely true. But he said it anyway because some lies are the only thing holding a man upright. Ditad. The afternoon shift was slow. Seattle in November had a way of emptying the streets, not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, like the city itself was exhaling. The rain came and went in light sheets, more mist than storm, the kind that didn't bother opening an umbrella for. A few regulars came in. Ethan made their drinks, smiled when he needed to refill the pastry case, wiped down the counter. He was in the middle of restacking cups when the door opened. He didn't look up immediately. The bell above the door rang maybe 60 times a day, and he'd trained himself out of reacting to it. He heard the sound of wheels on hardwood, smooth, deliberate moving, with the quiet efficiency of someone who knew exactly where they were going. "Excuse me." The voice was calm, measured, the kind of voice that was accustomed to being listened to without having to raise itself. Ethan looked up. The woman in the wheelchair was perhaps his age, maybe a year or two older. She was dressed simply but precisely: dark blazer, silk blouse, hair pulled back in a way that suggested someone had arranged it carefully that morning. She had sharp dark eyes and a stillness about her that didn't read as cold exactly, but as someone who had learned to hold themselves very deliberately in the world. "What can I get you?" Ethan asked. She didn't answer right away. She was looking at him in a way that made him feel like he was being placed somewhere, filed into a memory, matched against something she already knew. "You don't recognize me," she said. It wasn't a question. It carried the faintest edge of something not quite hurt, but close to it. Ethan looked at her more carefully. He was not especially good with faces out of context. "I'm sorry, have we—" "3 years ago," she said. "The intersection of 5th and Madison. It was raining much harder than today. You pulled me back from a cab that ran the light." She paused. "I was in a manual chair then. I wasn't paying attention. The cab would have—" She stopped, recalibrated. "You probably don't even remember it." He did suddenly. Not her face, he hadn't gotten a good look at her face. It had all happened too fast. But the moment itself came back with startling clarity. The screech of tires, the instinct that moved his arm before his brain caught up the weight of someone's shoulder against his palm, the cab blasting past close enough to feel the rush of air. "I remember," he said. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, but something that moved in that direction. "Victoria Hale," she said. The name landed like a dropped glass. Victoria Hale. He knew that name. Everyone in Seattle who read a business page knew that name. Hale Technologies. Medical devices, clean energy infrastructure, half a dozen other sectors he couldn't name off the top of his head. The kind of company that had its own floor of a downtown skyscraper, the kind that sponsored galas and university endowments, and had its CEO photographed with senators. He started. "I am," she said simply. No performance in it, just confirmation. He didn't know what to say to that, so he fell back on what he knew how to do. "What can I get you?" "A black coffee," she said, "and a few minutes of your time if you can spare them." Conk. He brought the coffee. He told Dale he was stepping out for a break. Dale looked at the woman at the corner table, looked back at Ethan, and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Ethan sat across from Victoria Hale, with his hands wrapped around his own cup, and waited. "I've been looking for you," she said. "It took longer than I expected. You're not easy to find." "I'm a barista in Seattle," he said. "We're not exactly rare." "You weren't a barista 3 years ago." He absorbed that. "You did your homework." "I do my homework on everything," she said, not arrogantly, just factually. "I know about your wife. I'm sorry. I know about your daughters. I know about the career gap, the debt, the apartment." She paused. "I'm not saying that to unsettle you. I'm saying it so you understand that what I'm about to propose isn't casual." Ethan set down his cup. "What exactly are you proposing?" She met his eyes directly. "I want to offer you a marriage arrangement." The cafe was quiet enough that he could hear the rain against the window. I'm going to need you to say that again, he said. A marriage arrangement, she repeated. Contractual. Clearly defined terms. I need the image of a family, specifically a husband and children, for a board presentation in 4 months that will determine the future of my company. There are members of my board who are very traditional. They've questioned my ability to lead with stability. A family changes that narrative. She said it all without blinking, without apologizing. In exchange, your daughters get everything. Private school, medical coverage, a home without an eviction notice on the door. And you get financial stability enough to clear your debt, restart your career on your own terms, and never worry about 30 days again. Ethan stared at her for a long moment. You're serious, he said. I don't make jokes about business. This isn't business, he said. This is my family. Yes, she said, which is exactly why I'm being this careful about it. He leaned back. He felt something tightening in his chest, not anger, not quite, something more defensive than that. You looked me up, you found out everything about my life, and you came in here and laid this out like I'm a... He stopped himself. Like you're what? She asked quietly. Like I'm desperate enough to say yes to anything. She didn't flinch. She also didn't deny it. You are in a difficult position, she said. I won't pretend otherwise because I think you'd respect me less if I did. But I want to be very clear, I'm not here to exploit you. I'm here because you're the one person who gave me something I couldn't buy. She paused. You saved my life without knowing who I was, without asking for anything. That matters to me. It shapes who I choose to trust. Ethan was quiet. Outside, the rain picked up. I have 2 little girls, he said finally. Sophia's 7, Chloe's 5. They've already lost their mother. They've already been uprooted once. I am not going to make them props in a... They wouldn't be props, she said. They would be. And here, for the first time, something cracked slightly in her composure. Not much. Just enough to be real. They would be the part of this that isn't strategic. He looked at her. I have a large home, she said. Too large. It's very quiet. I have staff who are professional and efficient and completely impersonal. I have everything a person is supposed to want, and almost none of what a person actually needs. She said it without self-pity. Just clarity. I'm not asking you to fall in love with me, Mr. Carter. I'm asking you to give your daughters a life they deserve. And I suppose... She looked down at her coffee for the first time. I'm asking for something I don't entirely know how to name yet. The bell above the door rang. 2 customers came in shaking rain off their jackets, laughing about something. Ethan watched them for a second. Then he looked back at Victoria. I need time, he said. Of course. And I need to hear this from a lawyer, not your lawyer, mine. I'll cover the legal fees, she said. Name your attorney. I don't have one. I'll provide 3 names. You choose. The retainer will be paid independently of any agreement between us, so there's no conflict of interest. She reached into the inside pocket of her blazer and set a card on the table. Plain white, just her name and a number. Take whatever time you need. I'm not going anywhere. He picked up the card. He turned it over once. Turned it back. Why me? He said. Genuinely. You could find anyone. I could find someone who wants the money, she said. I needed someone I could trust with something more than money. She looked at him steadily. You're the only person I've met in 15 years of business who did something purely because it was right. That's not as common as people think. He stood up. He put the card in his shirt pocket right over his heart, without quite meaning to. I'll think about it, he said. She nodded once. She picked up her coffee cup, and as he turned to go back behind the counter, she said quietly without looking up, Your daughters are lucky to have you. He stopped. He didn't turn around. He stood there for just a second, the noise of the cafe around him, the rain against the glass, 30 days sitting in his jacket pocket, and felt something inside him he hadn't felt in a very long time. Not hope exactly, but the place where Hope used to live, remembering what it felt like to be warm. That night, after the girls were in bed, he sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours. He looked at the eviction notice. He looked at the credit card statements he kept in a folder he rarely opened anymore. He looked at a photo on the fridge, Diane laughing at the beach, Sophia on her hip, Chloe blurring past in the corner of the frame. Then he took Victoria Hale's card out of his shirt pocket and set it next to the eviction notice. The two pieces of paper sat side by side on the table, like a choice that hadn't asked his permission to become one. He heard Chloe cough in the next room. He heard Sophia's voice, soft and sleepy, saying something to her sister, the way she always checked on her. The way she'd been doing it since Diane died, this 7-year-old standing in for a mother she didn't have anymore. Ethan put his face in his hands. He didn't cry. He'd gotten past the crying stage. This was something quieter and harder than crying the part that came after, when you've run out of tears, and all that's left is the weight of what you're responsible for, and the terrifying arithmetic of how short you're falling. He picked up his phone. He dialed the number on the card. It rang twice. "Mr. Carter," said Victoria Hale like she'd been expecting him. "I have conditions," he said. A pause. Then, "Tell me." And he started talking. His conditions weren't complicated. That was what surprised her. Ethan had expected himself to demand money first, a number, a figure, something concrete he could hold on to. Instead, what came out of his mouth when she answered the phone was something he hadn't planned to say at all. "My daughters don't get lied to." A pause on her end. Meaning they're 7 and 5, not stupid. If we do this, we tell them something true. Not the whole truth, they're too young for contracts and board meetings, but something they can believe without it becoming a lie they carry into adulthood. He was pacing the kitchen now, speaking quietly so he wouldn't wake them. "I won't let them bond with you and then have the rug pulled. If this ends, it ends with honesty. Agreed?" "Agreed," she said. No hesitation. "Second condition, I stay their father, not a figurehead, not a prop. I make decisions about their school, their health, their routines. You don't override me on anything involving them without a conversation first. That's reasonable?" "Third." He stopped pacing. "You treat them like people, not accessories. If I ever feel like they're being used for appearances in photos and public events, in anything that puts them on display for your board's benefit, I walk. Contract or no contract?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Mr. Carter," Victoria said slowly, "I want you to hear me clearly. I don't have a strategy for your daughters. I don't have a plan for how to use them or position them or what to do with them at events. I genuinely don't know how to be around children. That's not a confession of bad intent, it's just the truth. I've never had that in my life." She stopped. "I suppose that's its own kind of condition. You'd have to be patient with that." He hadn't expected that. He sat down. "Fourth condition," he said, quieter now. "We're honest with each other. When it's not working, we say so. No performance behind closed doors." Agreed. "And fifth." He looked at the eviction notice on the table. "The money doesn't come first. I want a trial period. 30 days living arrangement as discussed. If at the end of 30 days either one of us decides this is wrong, we walk away clean. No financial strings attached yet. I don't want to feel bought." The silence on the line stretched long enough that he thought he'd miscalculated, pushed too hard, asked for the one thing she couldn't give. Then, "You know that's a significant risk for me." "I know. The board presentation is in 4 months. If we dissolve after 30 days, I lose." "I know what you lose," he said. "But you asked me to trust you. That's what trust looks like before the paperwork." Another long pause. He heard her breathe. 30 days, she said finally. Trial period. No financial commitment, until both parties agree to proceed. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," she said. And he thought he could hear the ghost of something almost like amusement in her voice. "You haven't seen the house." He told the girls the next morning. He sat them down at the kitchen table with their cereal in front of them, and his coffee untouched, and he said, "I need to talk to you about something important." Which was a phrase that made Sophia immediately go still and watchful in the way she always did. That stillness she'd developed after Diane died, like she was braced for the next thing the world was about to take from them. Chloe, who had not yet developed the same vigilance, just kept eating her cereal. "Remember how I told you we might have to move again?" he started. Sophia nodded. "Well, I met someone. A woman. Her name is Victoria, and she's offered us a place to stay, a much bigger place, while we figure some things out." "Is she your girlfriend?" Sophia asked immediately. "No," he said. She's someone I helped a long time ago, and now she's helping us. She's a good person, I think." He caught himself. "I believe she is." "Does she have kids?" Chloe asked, mouth still half full. "No, she doesn't." "Does she have dogs?" I didn't ask about dogs." Chloe considered this. "Can we ask her?" "Sure," he said. "You can ask her." Sophia was quiet for a moment. She was looking at him with that careful, measuring look that sometimes made him feel like she was the parent and he was the child. "Is she nice, Daddy?" He thought about Victoria's face when she'd said, "Your daughters are lucky to have you." The way she hadn't looked at him when she said it. The way it had come out like something that had been stored a long time. "I think she's trying to be," he said honestly. Sophia nodded slowly. That seemed to satisfy her in a way a more confident answer might not have. She went back to her cereal. Chloe immediately asked if they could bring their stuffed animals. "Every single one," he said. Check. The lawyer's name was Frank Diallo, one of the 3 names Victoria had texted him the following morning with a note that said simply, "All 3 are excellent. None of them owe me anything." He'd picked Diallo because he'd found an interview where the man had represented a foster parent pro bono against a negligent state agency. That told him something. He met Diallo in a small office in Capitol Hill on a Thursday afternoon while the girls were at school. Diallo was a compact, sharp-eyed man in his 60s who read through the draft agreement Victoria had already sent over and asked questions like he was pulling at loose threads. "She's not asking for parental rights," Diallo noted. "Not asking for guardianship, not even a formal step-parent role. She's asking for cohabitation and a public family image. That's all." "Is that unusual? For a contract of this size?" Diallo looked up over his glasses. "Yes. Usually people with her resources build in more leverage." He set the papers down. "Either she has very good intentions, or she's planning to use informal influence rather than legal channels." "Which do you think?" Diallo studied him for a moment. "I think she's scared," he said, "of needing this more than she expected to." Ethan wasn't sure what to do with that. He took the contract home and read it 3 more times before he signed. Tug. They moved in on a Saturday. Ethan had been braced for the mansion. He'd looked it up, read the real estate listing from when Victoria had purchased it 6 years ago. 12,000 square feet waterfront, the kind of place that showed up in architecture magazines. He'd prepared himself to feel small inside it. What he hadn't prepared for was Sophia's face. She stepped through the front door, looked up at the ceiling. It was high cathedral, high with a chandelier that caught the November light, and said with complete sincerity, "Daddy, are we in a hotel? No, baby." "Are you sure?" Victoria was already there, rolling toward them from the far end of the entrance hall. She'd traded the blazer for something softer, a deep blue cardigan that made her look less like a magazine cover and more like a person. She stopped a few feet away and looked at the girls the way someone looks at something they've studied in theory but are encountering for the first time in practice. "You must be Sophia," she said, "and Chloe." Chloe walked straight up to her wheelchair without any of the hesitation adults usually brought to it and said, "How come your chair has that button on the side?" "It controls the speed," Victoria said. "Would you like to see?" Chloe's eyes went enormous. "Can it go fast?" "Reasonably fast for indoors." "Sophia." Chloe announced, turning around. Her chair goes fast. Sophia, who was still processing the chandelier, turned and looked at Victoria. A long look. The kind of look Ethan recognized his daughter taking stock. Then she said, "Do you have a dog?" Victoria blinked. "I don't." Sophia considered this. "Do you want one?" Victoria's mouth opened slightly. Closed. She looked at Ethan with an expression that said very clearly, "I was not prepared for this." And he almost laughed the first time he'd almost laughed in longer than he could remember. "Maybe," Victoria said carefully to Sophia. "We can talk about that." Sophia nodded, like a point had been granted in her favor, and walked past her into the house. The first week was like learning to live in a language you'd studied but never spoken aloud. The house had a routine staff arrived at specific times, meals were served in a formal dining room. Everything operated on a quiet, precise schedule that Victoria had lived inside alone for years. Ethan and the girls arrived and immediately disrupted all of it. Chloe's stuffed animals migrated into the kitchen. Sophia commandeered a window seat in the library for her homework and left papers everywhere. Ethan started making breakfast early in the morning because he always had, and the cook, Mrs. Beaumont, found him in the kitchen at 6:45 and looked at him like he'd broken into a museum. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm just making eggs. Do you want some?" Mrs. Beaumont, who had worked for Victoria for 4 years and had never once been offered breakfast, looked at the plate he extended toward her and accepted it without comment. She ate standing at the counter. After a moment, she said, "The girls take milk or juice in the morning." "Milk," he said. "Sophia hates juice. Chloe will drink anything." Mrs. Beaumont nodded like she was filing it away. "I'll keep that in mind." Victoria came to breakfast on the third morning. She hadn't the first two. Ethan hadn't pushed it. He understood that they were in her home, that she had her own rhythms, that appearing at a family breakfast table, when there had never been a family at it before, required something more than just deciding to show up. He'd left the kitchen open, left the table set with extra space, done nothing else. On the third morning, she appeared in the kitchen doorway at 7:15. She was dressed already composed, but there was something slightly uncertain in the way she stopped in the doorway rather than coming straight in. Chloe spotted her immediately. "Victoria, Daddy made the eggs with the cheese inside. Do you want some?" Victoria looked at Ethan. "Omelets," he said. "You want one?" A pause. "I usually just have coffee." "I know," he said. "You can have both." She came in. She sat at the far end of the table, and Ethan set a plate in front of her without ceremony, and Chloe immediately started telling her about a dream she'd had involving a horse and a very large sandwich. And Sophia looked up from the book she was reading at breakfast, a habit Ethan had long since given up trying to break, and said, "Do you read at breakfast?" "Sometimes," Victoria said, looking at the book. "What are you reading?" Sophia held it up. It was a chapter book about a girl who discovers her grandmother is a retired spy. "It's really good," Sophia said. "The grandmother pretends to be boring, but she's actually the most interesting person in the book." Victoria looked at the cover for a moment. "I think I understand that, grandmother," she said. Sophia studied her. Then she went back to reading, which Ethan had learned was his daughter's highest form of acceptance. If she kept reading near you, you'd passed. He turned back to the stove so Victoria wouldn't see that he was smiling. What he hadn't expected, what he hadn't let himself expect, was how hard Victoria worked at it. Not the public part. He'd assumed she'd be precise and capable at the visible performance of family events, photos, appearances. What surprised him was the private effort. The way she asked him questions at night after the girls were in bed, sitting across from him in the living room with tea she'd started making instead of just coffee. Real questions, not small talk. "Sophia goes quiet when she's overwhelmed," she said one evening. "Is that correct?" He looked up from the papers he was reviewing. "Yeah. She shuts down and processes. You have to give her space first, then ask." "And Chloe?" "Chloe goes loud when she's overwhelmed. She talks more, gets physical bounces around. You have to match her energy down gradually. If you tell her to calm down directly, she escalates. Victoria was quiet, absorbing this. He could see her doing it, categorizing, filing the same focused precision she probably applied to a quarterly report. Except she wasn't doing it to strategize. She was doing it because she was genuinely trying to understand two children who had landed in her house and somehow in 8 days had entirely rearranged its atmosphere. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask me anything," she said. "I may not answer, but you can always ask. What was your house like before we got here?" She held her cup in both hands. "Quiet," she said. "Very efficient. Everyone did exactly what they were supposed to do." She paused. "I thought I liked it. I'm now less certain." "Chloe left a sock on your staircase railing this morning." "I saw it." "Did you move it?" "No," she said, and something in her voice was very careful when she said it. "I left it there." He looked at her. She looked back at him steadily, without apology, as if daring him to make something of it. He decided not to. "We should talk about the board presentation," he said instead. "What exactly do you need from us and when?" She set her cup down, back on firm ground. "There's a formal dinner in 3 weeks. Board members and their spouses. I'd like you to attend as my husband or the man I'm introducing as my partner. The legal status doesn't need to be established yet. The story is simply that we're together, that you and your daughters have moved in, and that I'm—" She stopped. "That you're what?" She looked at her hands. "That I'm not alone anymore," she said quietly. "That's what they need to see. That's the part they don't believe." The room was very quiet. "Okay," Ethan said. She looked up. "Okay. We'll go to the dinner." He paused. "But I need you to understand something. When I'm standing next to you telling people we're together, I'm not going to be performing. I don't know how to do that. I'll just be standing next to you." She held his gaze. "That's all I'm asking for." "All right then." He picked up his papers again. She picked up her cup. Outside, the Seattle rain moved against the windows in long, slow sweeps, and the house, for the first time in a very long while, felt like something other than empty. It didn't feel like family yet. He wasn't naive enough to call it that. But it felt like the beginning of something that might, if they were careful and honest and patient with each other, become something worth protecting. Chalk. On the 14th day, Chloe climbed into Victoria's lap. Without warning, without asking. She just walked up beside the wheelchair while Victoria was reading something on her tablet and hoisted herself up the way 5-year-olds hoist themselves onto things, with complete confidence and zero regard for the logistics. Victoria went completely still. Ethan, who was across the room and saw it happen, started to get up. Victoria caught his eye and gave the faintest shake of her head, so he stayed where he was. Chloe settled herself, looked at the tablet screen and said, "What are you reading?" "Work," Victoria said. Her voice was slightly different, not cold, just careful, the way you are when you're holding something fragile and you've only just realized it. "Is it boring?" "Sometimes." Chloe leaned back against her and yawned. "Daddy's work stuff is boring too," she confided. "But he does it anyway." "That's what responsible people do," Victoria said. "Are you responsible?" "I try to be." Chloe seemed to accept this. She stayed there for 20 minutes, while Victoria read, occasionally asking what a word meant, and Victoria answered everyone without making her feel small for asking. When Chloe finally slid down and ran off to find Sophia, Victoria sat very still for a moment. Then she set her tablet down. She looked across the room at Ethan. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything, but something had passed between them. Something neither of them had a contract for. Neither of them had negotiated. Neither of them had expected when they sat across a cafe table in the rain and talked about terms and conditions and the careful arithmetic of need. Something that didn't have a name yet, but was already real. The board dinner was on a Thursday. Ethan had one good suit. He'd bought it for Diane's funeral and worn it twice, since once for a job interview he didn't get, once for a parent-teacher conference where he'd overdressed so badly that Sophia's teacher had asked if he was also meeting with the principal. The suit was fine. It was dark navy, well cut, and it still fit because grief had a way of keeping a man lean. He put it on in the guest room that had become his room, checked himself in the mirror once, and went downstairs. Victoria was in the entrance hall. She was wearing deep burgundy, a dress that was elegant, without announcing itself, the kind of clothing that understood it didn't need to compete with the person wearing it. Her hair was down for the first time since he'd met her. She looked in a way that caught him off guard, genuinely beautiful. Not in the magazine cover way he'd unconsciously associated with her name. In a quieter way. A real way. She looked at him when he came down the stairs. He looked at her. Neither of them said the obvious thing, which was probably the right call. "The girls are settled," she asked. "Mrs. Beaumont has a movie lined up, and Chloe has already negotiated for extra popcorn." She negotiated. She does that. I don't know where she got it from. Victoria almost smiled. "Ready?" "No," he said honestly. "But let's go anyway." The restaurant was the kind of place where the lighting was designed to make everyone look important, and the menu didn't have prices. Ethan had been to exactly one place like this in his life, a work dinner years ago before everything fell apart. He remembered feeling the same thing then that he felt now, the specific discomfort of being in a room where the rules were unspoken and everyone else had apparently been born knowing them. He stayed close to Victoria without hovering. That was the calibration he'd decided on in the car, close enough to read as a partner, far enough to not look like he was performing it. The board members arrived in pairs the way powerful people always seem to move in configurations that doubled their gravity. Ethan shook hands and smiled and said the right things, and he was good at it. Actually better than he'd expected, because he'd spent 2 years in logistics management, learning to read rooms and hold his own in conversations he hadn't been invited into. He hadn't lost that. It had just been sitting unused. The trouble started with Gerald Marsh. Marsh was 71, silver-haired, the kind of man who wore a watch that cost more than Ethan's car and wanted you to notice it. He was on Victoria's board and had been, according to what little Victoria had shared, one of the most vocal skeptics of her leadership. He shook Ethan's hand with the particular firmness of a man who uses handshakes as assessments. "So, you're the man Victoria's been keeping secret," Marsh said. His smile was wide and entirely uninformative. "I wouldn't say secret," Ethan said. "We're pretty private people." "And what is it you do, Ethan?" "I'm in transition right now. Spent a decade in logistics management, taking some time to be present for my daughters while I figure out the next move." Marsh nodded slowly, the way people nod when they're not listening, but want credit for appearing to. "Daughters," he repeated. "Right. Victoria mentioned." He glanced toward her with an expression that was readable only if you were paying attention. Quite the ready-made family. It was a small sentence. Diplomatically deniable. Ethan let it land and then let it go, the way you learn to let things go when you've spent 2 years surviving on the goodwill of people who might rescind it. "We're lucky to have each other," he said simply. Marsh looked at him a moment longer than necessary, then turned to speak to someone else. Victoria had caught it. She said nothing until they were momentarily alone at the far end of the table, and then she said quietly, without looking at him, "I'm sorry about Gerald." "Don't be," he said. "I've met Gerald's before. He's been on my board for 9 years. He voted against my appointment as CEO. And now he has to watch you run the company he didn't think you could run." Ethan picked up his water glass. "That's its own reward." This time she did almost smile. "You're surprisingly good at this." "I grew up with 4 brothers," he said. "You learn to read who's actually dangerous and who's just loud." "Which is Gerald?" "Loud," Ethan said. "But the kind of loud that gets quieter when he realizes he's not getting a reaction." She turned her head slightly toward him. The angle put them closer than they'd been in public before. "How do you know that?" "Because he looked back twice to see if you'd noticed his comment," he said. "Dangerous men don't look back." She was quiet for a moment. "I've been in rooms with Gerald Marsh for 9 years," she said, "and I never thought of it that way. You were busy running a company. You don't have time to study everybody. And you do. I'm a barista, he said. I study people all day. It's the only interesting part of the job. She laughed. Not a polite laugh, a real one, sudden and brief, quickly recovered. But real. The woman next to Marsh heard it and looked over, and what she saw was exactly what Victoria needed her to see. Two people at ease with each other, the specific ease of people who have been honest with one another in private and don't need to perform it in public. Ethan didn't point that out. He just reached for the breadbasket and passed it to her. On the drive home, Victoria was quiet for a long time. The city moved past the windows in long amber streaks, and the driver was a careful, silent man named Rowan, who had apparently mastered the art of not existing in his own car. Ethan watched the rain come back. It always came back in Seattle like it had nowhere else to be, and waited. "Gerald will be a problem," she said finally. "He already is. He's going to ask questions about our timeline, how we met, whether the arrangement is genuine." She said the last word carefully. "What did you tell them tonight?" "Nothing specific. I let them draw conclusions." Ethan turned from the window. "Victoria, if Marsh starts digging, how far does it go before something falls apart?" She met his eyes. In the dark of the car, her expression was harder to read, but he'd been getting better at it over 2 weeks of shared mornings and quiet evenings and conversations that ran longer than either of them had planned. "It depends," she said, "on what he finds." "What could he find?" A pause. "There's a situation," she said, "that I've been meaning to tell you about. I was waiting for the right time, which I now recognize was a way of avoiding it." He felt something tighten in his chest. "Tell me." Hale Technologies acquired a logistics firm 18 months ago, a mid-size operation called Meridian Supply. She kept her eyes on him. During the integration, Meridian's regional management was restructured significantly. About 60% of senior staff were let go. Ethan was very still. "Your former employer," she said, "was a contracted partner of Meridian. When Meridian restructured, they terminated several vendor contracts, which created a cascade effect for their partners." She stopped. "I had my team do a full audit 2 weeks ago when I started seriously pursuing this arrangement. Your career disruption, the gap, the reason you lost your position, it traces back indirectly to decisions made during that acquisition." The car was silent, except for the rain. "Indirectly," he said. "The board decision to acquire Meridian was mine," she said. "The restructuring decisions were made by an integration team. I didn't know your name. I didn't know you existed. But the chain leads back to a decision I made." She held his gaze without flinching. "I'm telling you this because you have conditions, and one of them is honesty. And this is the hardest thing I've had to be honest about since we met." Ethan looked at her for a long time. He thought about the phone call, the one from his supervisor 18 months ago, 2 months after Diane died, when he was barely holding himself upright. Budget restructuring, vendor contracts reassessed. "We're going to have to let you go." He'd sat in his car in the parking garage for 40 minutes before he could drive home. He'd sat there and thought, "This is the part where I fall apart." And then he'd thought, "I have 2 daughters." And he'd driven home instead. "You knew this before tonight," he said. "I've known for 2 weeks. And you chose now, after the dinner, after I stood next to you and told Gerald Marsh we were lucky to have each other." "I know how that looks," she said. "Do you—" He wasn't raising his voice. It wasn't that kind of anger. It was the cold, flat kind, the kind that comes when the thing you were afraid of turns out to be true in a way you didn't quite predict. "Because what it looks like is that you needed me functional tonight, and you told me after." She didn't deny it. She didn't make excuses. She just said, "Yes, that's what I did. And I can tell you that I didn't plan it that way, that I was genuinely afraid of how you'd react, that I convinced myself I needed more time, and all of that is true. But so is what you just said." She kept her voice steady. "I used bad judgment. I prioritized my own fear over your right to know. I'm sorry." The car stopped at a light. Ethan looked out the window. A couple stood under an awning across the street, sharing an umbrella, arguing about something that looked minor, and felt from the outside like the luxury of people whose problems were small enough to argue about under an umbrella. "Did you know when you came into the cafe?" he asked. "No, I found out during the audit, after." "If you'd known before the cafe." She considered this genuinely, which he appreciated. She didn't rush to reassure him. "I'd like to think I would have told you immediately. I genuinely don't know." He turned back to her. "That's honest, at least." "It's all I have." The car started moving again. He let the silence run for another block. Then he said, "I'm not walking. I want you to know that. I'm angry, and I have a right to be angry, and I'm going to need some time before this sits right with me, but I'm not walking." She exhaled, just slightly, the smallest release of something she'd been holding. "Why not?" "Because my daughters have already started trusting this house," he said. "And because you told me. You could have buried it. Your audit team, your lawyers, no one was going to surface this on their own. You chose to tell me." He looked at her. "People who are actually trying to exploit you don't tell you the thing that gives you power over them." She was quiet for a moment. "I hadn't thought of it in those terms." "I know you hadn't. That's the point." He didn't sleep well that night. He lay in the dark of his room in Victoria's house and stared at the ceiling and ran the arithmetic again. Not the financial kind, but the other kind, the moral kind, the one where you try to figure out if you're making a mistake or making a sacrifice and how you're supposed to tell the difference from the inside. His career had ended because of a business decision made in a boardroom by someone who didn't know he existed. That was true. It was also true that the same person had pulled him out of a cafe and offered him something he hadn't known how to ask for. It was also true that grief had already taken so much from him that he'd stopped expecting the universe to be fair, and that maybe fairness wasn't the right measure anymore. He thought about Diane. He did that sometimes in the dark when the girls were asleep and there was no task to perform. He thought about what she would say. Diane had been the more pragmatic of the two of them, which surprised people who met her, because she laughed easily and cried at commercials and seemed soft in all the ways that matter. But she was clear-eyed about people. She read them fast, and she read them right. "So what do you think she's doing?" he asked her in the way you talk to the dead when you miss them badly enough to need an answer. He could almost hear it. Diane's voice calm and slightly impatient the way she got when she thought he was overcomplicating something. "She's trying, Ethan." "That's what it looks like when someone's actually trying." He closed his eyes. In the morning, he went downstairs and found Victoria already in the kitchen. Not at the table in the kitchen near the counter, watching Mrs. Beaumont with an expression that suggested she was attempting to understand the process of making pancakes through careful observation alone. "You're up early," he said. She turned. There were slight shadows under her eyes that told him she hadn't slept easily either. "I wanted to do something," she said. "I asked Mrs. Beaumont to teach me how to make the girls' pancakes." Mrs. Beaumont, who had the face of a woman who had seen everything, held up the bowl she was mixing without comment. Ethan looked at Victoria, at the bowl, at the way she was holding herself, not with the precise composure of a CEO, but with something more effortful, more exposed. The look of someone who didn't know if the gesture would land, and was making it anyway. "Chloe likes blueberries in hers," he said after a moment. "Sophia likes chocolate chips, but only if they're distributed evenly. She will notice if they're not." "I'll be precise about the chocolate chips," Victoria said. "She'll test you." "I know." She looked at him steadily. "I'm prepared to be tested." He held her gaze for a second. Then he walked to the cabinet and pulled out 2 mugs and started making coffee without being asked, the way he did every morning, because it was his kitchen now too, or something close enough to his that the difference was becoming harder to locate. "We're okay," he said, not a question. She accepted her coffee when he handed it to her. We're working on it," he said, which is the same thing mostly. Mrs. Beaumont pretended to be very interested in the batter. From upstairs came the sound of Chloe at full volume, asking Sophia something with the urgency of a person who has just remembered something critical, and Sophia's quieter, measured response, and then the distinct thump of two small sets of feet hitting the floor and heading for the stairs. Victoria turned toward the sound instinctively. Something moved in her face, something unguarded and quick there and gone before she quite had time to put a name to it. But Ethan saw it. He'd been watching her for 3 weeks. He was getting good at reading the things she hadn't decided to show yet. Chloe appeared in the kitchen doorway at full speed, hair still chaotic from sleep in the pajamas with the frogs on them that she refused to retire, despite having outgrown them 3 months ago. She looked at Victoria at the counter, and her face broke entirely open. "Are you making pancakes?" "Attempting to," Victoria said. "Can I help?" Victoria glanced at Ethan. He gave nothing, just watched. Her call. "Yes," she said. "Come tell me about the blueberries." Chloe launched herself across the kitchen and climbed up on the step stool that had appeared near the counter at some point in the last week. Ethan hadn't put it there, which meant someone on the staff had noticed that a 5-year-old needed a foothold in this kitchen and had quietly made it possible. That small thing sat in his chest in a way he hadn't expected. Sophia came in a minute later, still holding her book, and surveyed the scene with her characteristic deliberateness. Then she looked at Ethan. "Is the chocolate chip distribution going to be an issue?" "Victoria knows about the distribution," he said. Sophia looked at Victoria. Victoria looked back at her with an expression of complete seriousness. "I've been briefed," Victoria said. "Even placement, no clustering." Sophia considered this. Then she put her book down on the table, her book in Victoria's kitchen, like it lived there, and sat down. "Okay," she said. "I'll supervise." After breakfast, after the girls were dressed and doing the reading homework, Sophia had insisted. Couldn't wait. Ethan found himself standing beside Victoria in the hallway outside the kitchen. Just the two of them for a moment. "The step stool," he said. She didn't pretend not to know what he meant. "I asked James to pick it up on Monday, after I saw Chloe trying to drag a chair over to see what was on the counter." She paused. It seemed like the practical thing. He looked at her, at the woman who ran a billion-dollar company and had held herself at careful distance from the world for years, and had at some point in the last 3 weeks started quietly making a house more habitable for a 5-year-old who wasn't hers. "Victoria," he said. "Yes." He looked for the right words and didn't quite find them, so he said what was true instead of what was complete. "Thank you for last night, for telling me." She nodded once, precise, controlled. "And for the step stool," he added. Something shifted in her face. That same movement he'd caught earlier, the unguarded thing, quick and real. This time she let it stay a little longer before she composed herself again. "Don't read too much into a step stool," she said. "I'm not," he said. "I'm just reading exactly what it is." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she moved past him down the hall, back toward her office, back toward the company and the board and the world she commanded. But before she turned the corner, she slowed just slightly. Just for a second, in the way of someone who is about to say something and decides instead to carry it a little longer. He let her go. Some things didn't need to be said yet. They just needed to be true. And this, whatever this was becoming in this house, around this table, over these pancakes, between these two people who had arrived at each other through loss and practicality, and the strange, stubborn persistence of doing right by the people who needed you. This was already true. Whether either of them was ready to name it was a different question entirely. 3 weeks and Gerald Marsh made his move. Ethan found out the way he found out most things that happened in Victoria's world, not from Victoria directly, but from the particular quality of her silence at breakfast. She'd been quiet before, but this was a different kind of quiet. Tighter. The kind that had something specific at the center of it. "What happened?" he asked. She looked up from her coffee. "Good morning." "Victoria." She set the cup down. Sophia was at school. Chloe was upstairs with Mrs. Beaumont, engaged in what had become their Tuesday morning ritual of watching nature documentaries and providing running commentary. They were alone in the kitchen, which was the only reason she said it directly. "Gerald has filed a formal inquiry with the board. He's questioning the legitimacy of our relationship. He's asking for documentation how long we've known each other, the timeline witnesses who can speak to the relationship before the arrangement began." She said it the way she delivered every difficult thing, straight clean, no softening. "He's also suggesting that the girl's presence is a calculated move, and that bringing children into a manufactured family situation raises ethical questions about my judgment." Ethan put down his fork. He said that, about the girls. In writing. To the full board. To the three most senior members, which is effectively the full board in terms of influence. She watched him carefully. "I want you to know that I am handling it. I have legal counsel preparing a response. I don't need you to—" "He brought my daughters into it," Ethan said. His voice was level, but something underneath it was not. "Ethan, I heard the legal part. I'll hear the rest of it in a minute." He stood up and walked to the window and stood there with his back to her for a moment. Not because he was shutting her out, she could tell the difference by now, but because he needed 5 seconds to let the heat of it move through him without doing anything with it. She'd learned that about him in 3 weeks. He didn't suppress anger. He just processed it standing up. He turned back around. "What does your lawyer say?" "That Gerald's inquiry is procedurally valid but substantively thin. He doesn't have evidence of anything improper because there isn't any. What we have is unconventional, but it isn't fraudulent." She paused. "The harder problem is the timeline. He's right that our public relationship appeared very quickly. If he pushes on that, the narrative becomes harder to defend." "Then we tell the truth," Ethan said. She looked at him. "Not all of it, but enough." He came back to the table and sat down. "You reached out to someone you'd been looking for. Someone from your past. Things moved quickly because we're both practical people in complicated situations, and we decided not to waste time pretending otherwise." He met her eyes. "That's true. Every word of it." She was quiet for a moment. "It doesn't explain why a man who met me 3 weeks ago moved his daughters into my home." "Yes, it does," he said. "Because I'm a father with 30 days on an eviction notice and 2 daughters who needed stability, and I made a decision." He held her gaze. "People who haven't been that desperate won't understand it. People who have will believe it immediately." She studied him. "You're not bothered by how it sounds." "I've been bothered by how things sound for 2 years," he said. "I'm done with that. The truth is what happened. The truth is also that whatever started as a practical arrangement—" He stopped himself, then continued carefully, "has become something I'm not willing to let Gerald Marsh define." The kitchen was quiet. "I'll call my lawyer this afternoon," she said finally. "Good. And I want to write a statement. From me, not from your legal team. My words about my daughters, about my decision to come here. Gerald put them in his inquiry. They deserve someone to speak for them directly." She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved in her expression that she didn't manage to entirely contain. "All right," she said. "All right," he said, and they went back to their coffee, and the morning reassembled itself around them, and neither of them acknowledged that what had just happened was the first time Ethan had said, the first time he'd placed himself on her side of something without being asked. Oig. He wrote the statement that afternoon at the kitchen table. He wrote 4 drafts. The first was too angry. The second was too defensive. The third was too careful he could hear the lawyer in it, the hedging, the passive constructions. The fourth he wrote without stopping, without editing himself the way he used to write emails to Diane when he had something important to say and couldn't find the right starting point except to just start. He wrote about Sophia and Chloe, about what it meant to be their father, the specific, unglamorous, unrelenting weight of it, the way you never stop calculating whether what you're doing is enough, whether the choice you're making at this specific moment is going to be the one they remember when they're 40 and talking to a therapist. He wrote about the eviction notice. He wrote about the cafe and the conversation and the conditions he'd set and the reasons behind each one. He wrote about what he'd seen in Victoria in the weeks since, not in broad strokes, not in the language of a press release, but the specific things. The step stool. The pancakes. The way she answered every question Chloe asked without making her feel small for asking. The way she'd told him about the Meridian acquisition at the cost of her own position when she could have buried it. He wrote, "These are not the actions of a woman constructing an image. These are the actions of someone learning carefully and honestly what it means to be responsible for people who aren't her own. I recognize it because I've been doing the same thing for 2 years." He gave it to Victoria to read before sending it to her lawyers. She read it at the kitchen table while he cleaned up from dinner, and the girls were doing the elaborate pre-bed negotiation that consumed approximately 45 minutes of every evening. He wasn't watching her. He was being deliberate about not watching her. He heard the paper set down. "Ethan." He turned around. Her eyes were very bright. She wasn't crying. He'd never seen her cry, and he'd come to understand that this wasn't coldness, but something more complicated, the way some people learn to hold difficult things entirely in their bodies rather than their faces. But her eyes were bright, and her jaw was set with the precise effort of someone keeping something contained. "This is," she started. "Is it okay I can revise?" "Don't revise it," she said. Firm, immediate. "Don't change a single word." He nodded. She looked back down at the paper. Then she said quietly, almost to herself, "No one has ever—" She stopped. "I've had a communications team for 11 years. I have people whose job it is to speak on my behalf." She looked up. "No one has ever written anything about me that felt like they actually knew me." He didn't know what to say to that. He thought about saying something light, something that would give her an exit from the moment. He decided not to. "Then it's about time," he said. She held his gaze for 3 seconds, 4, and then she picked up the paper again and said, "I'll have the lawyers review it in the morning." And she was back, composed, precise, the CEO at the end of her day. But something had shifted in the room's atmosphere, and they both knew it, and neither of them addressed it directly. That had become their fluency. The things that lived in the space between what they said. Doug. On day 22, Sophia had a nightmare. Ethan heard her first. He always heard his daughters first. Some parental frequency that pulled him out of sleep before he was conscious of waking. He was in her room in under a minute, sitting on the edge of her bed, his hand on her back, talking her down from whatever the dream had been. She didn't tell him what the dream was about. She didn't have to. He knew the way he'd known for 18 months the shape of what lived in his daughter's sleep. "I'm here," he said. "Right here." She was calming. Her breathing was slowing. And then from the doorway a voice, "Sophia." They both looked up. Victoria was in the doorway. She'd come from the other wing further than Ethan's room, further down the hall. She was in her manual chair, the one she used inside at night, moving quietly. She'd heard. She'd come. Sophia looked at her for a moment. Then she said in a small, sleep-roughened voice, "I had a scary dream." "I heard," Victoria said. She stayed in the doorway, not pushing in, not retreating. Reading the room the way she'd learned to read rooms in the last 3 weeks. "Do you want me to go?" Sophia thought about it, genuinely considered it. Then she shook her head. Victoria came in. She stopped beside the bed, and Sophia, without the preliminary negotiation she applied to most things, just reached out and took her hand. Just like that. The simple, total trust of a child deciding in the middle of the night that someone was safe. Ethan watched Victoria receive it. Watched the way her hand closed carefully around his daughter's. Watched her face the way something in it came undone, and then slowly, gently remade itself into something softer than he'd ever seen on her. The three of them stayed like that for a while. Sophia drifted. Ethan stayed until her breathing was fully even. Then he looked at Victoria across his daughter's bed. She was looking at Sophia. Just looking at her with an expression that Ethan had no name for because he'd never seen it on her face before. Open, undefended, the look of someone standing in something they hadn't known they were walking toward. He stood up carefully so as not to wake Sophia. He touched Victoria's shoulder lightly, barely a touch, just an acknowledgement, and they both moved quietly back toward the door. In the hallway, she said nothing. She didn't need to. "Thank you," he said, low so it wouldn't carry. She shook her head slightly, as if thanking her was the wrong reading of it, as if she'd gotten something out of that room too, something she didn't have a word for yet, but intended to keep. Day 26 brought a different kind of crisis. Chloe got sick. Not dramatically, a fever that climbed to 102 by midday, a cough that rattled her whole small chest, the specific misery of a 5-year-old who doesn't understand why her body has stopped cooperating. Ethan kept her home from school and called the pediatrician and set up on the couch with her, the thermometer and the children's Tylenol and the box of tissues and the sippy cup of water she kept ignoring because she said it tasted like nothing. Victoria canceled 2 calls. He didn't ask her to. He didn't know she had, until Mrs. Beaumont mentioned it quietly in the kitchen while he was making soup. He went to find her in the hallway outside the living room where she was stopped just listening to the sound of Chloe asking for the 3rd time why she couldn't just get up and play. "You canceled calls," he said. "They weren't critical." "Victoria, one was a progress update that can be emailed. One was a call with the Singapore office that my deputy can handle." She looked at him steadily. "She's sick." He stared at her for a second. "What does that have to do with—" "I wanted to be here," she said simply, like that was the whole explanation, like it was obvious. He didn't have a response to that, so he said, "She's been asking about the nature documentary with the penguins. The one about emperor penguins surviving the Antarctic winter. You've seen it. I looked it up after she described it to me last week, in some detail." Victoria moved past him toward the living room. "I'll see if I can find it." He stood in the hallway for a moment after she'd gone in. He heard Chloe's voice pick up. "Victoria, Daddy's making soup, but I don't know if it's the good kind." And he heard Victoria's voice lower, steady, answering her. He heard Chloe settle. The particular reliable sound of a sick child finding comfort in someone's presence. He went back to the kitchen and stood at the stove and let himself feel it, the full weight of what was happening in this house, the thing that had started as a transaction, and was daily quietly, stubbornly refusing to stay one. He'd been a careful man for 2 years. Careful with his daughters' hearts, careful with his own, careful about what he let himself need, because he'd learned the hard way that need without certainty was its own kind of danger. He had not planned to let his guard down in someone else's house. He had not planned for the step stool. He had not planned for Sophia's hand finding Victoria's in the dark. He had not planned for any of this. But then he hadn't planned for Diane's death either. He hadn't planned for the eviction notice, or the rainy afternoon in the cafe, or the 4 words that had cracked his life open for the 2nd time. Planning, he was beginning to understand, was just what you did before life informed you of its actual intentions. The night before the 30-day mark, he found Victoria in the library. She was at the window, not reading, not working. Just at the window, which was unusual enough that he stopped in the doorway. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "I've been thinking," she said without turning around. "About the board marsh?" "No." A pause. "About tomorrow." He came in. He sat in the chair nearest to where she was. And she turned from the window. Her expression was difficult to read in the low light, but he'd gotten better at this, at finding her in the spaces between what she showed. "Tomorrow we make a decision," she said, "about whether to formalize the arrangement. I know. I want to ask you something first, and I need you to answer it honestly, not diplomatically." "When have I answered anything diplomatically?" She almost smiled. Almost. "Fair point." She folded her hands in her lap. Has it been too much for the girls? For you?" She stopped. "I'm aware that what I offered you was financial security and stability. I'm aware that what you've actually experienced is my board's political warfare, a revelation about your career, that I handled badly a sick child with no advance warning, and an arrangement that has been considerably less clean than the contract implied." She met his eyes directly. "I need to know if the cost of what I asked for has been fair to you." He looked at her for a long moment. You want to know if I regret it? I want to know if you should. He leaned back. He thought about the last 30 days, not the hard parts, those were easy to find. He thought about Sophia putting her book down on Victoria's kitchen table like it lived there. He thought about Chloe on her lap asking about the button on the wheelchair. He thought about breakfast getting louder every morning, about Mrs. Beaumont eating eggs, standing at the counter, about the step stool that appeared without being requested. He thought about the nightmare and the dark hallway and the careful way Victoria's hand had closed around his daughters. I don't regret it, he said. Ethan. I'm not being diplomatic, I'm telling you what's true. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Do you want to know what I thought this would be? I thought it would be hard and strange and clinical. I thought I'd feel like a prop in someone else's life. I thought my daughters would feel the distance between what this was and what a real home feels like. He paused. None of that happened. And that's not luck. That's you. She was very still. You worked at it, he said, every day. You showed up to breakfast when you didn't have to. You learned how they take their milk. You remembered about the chocolate chip distribution. You canceled calls when Chloe was sick. You came down a dark hallway in the middle of the night because a little girl you've known for 30 days had a nightmare. He held her gaze. You didn't have to do any of that. The contract didn't require any of that. You did it because you wanted to. And I see that. I've been seeing it the whole time. She looked at him steadily, the way she did when she was deciding something. There's something I haven't told you, she said. He waited. The board presentation, she said. The official reason for this arrangement. I want you to know. She stopped, then began again. 3 weeks ago, before the dinner, before Gerald's inquiry, I had a conversation with my attorney in which I acknowledged that the board's concerns had evolved past the point where a family image would be sufficient to address them. She kept her eyes on him. What that means is that this arrangement in its original form may not accomplish what I told you it would accomplish. The board situation is more complex than a dinner and a family narrative. He processed this. So the original reason was still real, she said quickly. The board pressure was real. The need for stability of image was real. But I may have simplified the situation, made it sound more solvable than it is. She looked at her hands. Which means that what I offered you, what I said I needed from you, I may have needed it for reasons that were not entirely the ones I stated. The library was very quiet. What were the other reasons? He asked. She looked up, and for the first time in 30 days, Victoria Hale, who ran a billion-dollar company, who sat across from senators and board members and never let them see her, uncertain, looked uncertain. I was lonely, she said. It came out stripped of everything. No framing, no context, no strategic presentation. Just the word and the woman behind it, and the 30 days of evidence that it was true. I have been lonely for a very long time, and when I found you in that cafe, I told myself it was business. I told myself it was a reasonable arrangement that served both parties. She paused. I think I told myself that because the alternative was admitting that I just needed. She stopped. He looked at her. At this woman who had built an empire and fortified herself inside it, who had lived in 12,000 square feet of quiet efficiency and called it a life, who had arrived at a cafe on a rainy afternoon with a business proposal and had then quietly over 30 days let a family dismantle every wall she'd built. Victoria, he said gently. She lifted her chin slightly, that composure reflex, the one she reached for when something threatened to overflow. Don't, he said. You don't have to do that, not here. Her jaw worked once. The chin came back down. I know, she said, barely audible. He reached across the distance between their chairs. He set his hand on hers, not the way she'd held Sophia's tight with newness, but lightly, the way you touch something you've decided to take care of. I'll sign tomorrow, he said. She looked at their hands, then up at him. You still want to? The contract was never the point, he said. You know that. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I'm not sure I know how to do this. Neither do I, he said. We'll figure it out the same way we figured out the last 30 days. One breakfast at a time. Something crossed her face, the unguarded thing, the one she'd been letting stay a little longer each time it came. She didn't put it away this time. One breakfast at a time, she said. He left his hand where it was. Outside, the Seattle rain moved against the library windows, steady and unhurried, the way it always did, like it had decided long ago to stay. They signed the papers the next morning, not in a lawyer's office, not across a conference table with assistants taking notes. At the kitchen table. Frank Diallo came to the house, which Ethan suspected was not standard practice, but which Diallo executed with the matter-of-fact grace of a man who had learned to read what a situation actually needed. He set the documents down between the coffee cups, and the remnants of breakfast reviewed the key terms one final time, answered 3 questions from Ethan and 1 from Victoria, and then stepped back and let them sign without ceremony. Sophia watched from the doorway. Ethan had not told her to stay away. He had decided somewhere in the last 30 days that his daughters deserved to see the things that shaped their lives, rather than be shielded from them and handed the results. Sophia was 7. She didn't understand contracts, but she understood that something important was happening, and she understood with the particular intelligence she'd inherited from her mother that it was something she approved of. Chloe, who was fully recovered and operating at maximum volume, was in the backyard with Mrs. Beaumont, completely unaware that history was being made at the kitchen table, which was perhaps exactly right. When it was done, Diallo shook both their hands and let himself out. The kitchen was quiet. Ethan looked at Victoria. Victoria looked at him. The signed papers sat between them like something that had been a long time coming and had finally sensibly arrived. "Well," Ethan said. "Well," she said. Sophia came in from the doorway, walked to the table, looked at the papers, and then looked at Victoria with the seriousness of a small person who has been thinking something through. "Does this mean you're our family now?" she asked. Victoria opened her mouth, closed it. She looked at Ethan not for an answer, but for something else. Permission, maybe, or just the confirmation that she was reading the moment right. He gave her a small nod. She looked back at Sophia. "It means I'm trying to be," she said. "If you'll let me." Sophia considered this with the gravity it deserved. Then she said, "Chloe already decided. She decided like 2 weeks ago." "I know," Victoria said. Something in her voice was very careful and very full at the same time. "I noticed." "I take longer," Sophia said. "I know that too." Sophia looked at her for one more long moment. Then she walked forward and hugged her. Not the spontaneous full-body launch that Chloe favored, but deliberately with both arms around Victoria's shoulders, her face against her neck. Quiet, decided. The way Sophia did everything that mattered. Ethan watched Victoria's arms come up slowly around his daughter. He watched her close her eyes. He looked away, because some things are private, even when you're in the same room, and because he had something in his throat that he needed a minute with. He picked up the coffee cups and carried them to the sink and stood there looking out the kitchen window at the backyard where Chloe was attempting to teach Mrs. Beaumont a handshake she'd apparently invented. He heard Sophia pull back, heard her say something quiet to Victoria that he couldn't make out. He heard Victoria's voice answering low and steady. He had not planned for any of this. He had planned for 30 days of careful coexistence, for a business arrangement that served everyone's needs cleanly, for the maintenance of a clear line between what was real and what was contractual. He thought about that line now and realized with the simple clarity of someone who has finally stopped arguing with what's in front of him that the line had dissolved somewhere around day 14 when a 5-year-old climbed into a wheelchair without asking, and neither of them had done anything to stop it. Gerald Marsh made one more move. 3 days after the signing, his attorney contacted Victoria's legal team with a formal request for a private meeting. Marsh, Victoria, and representatives of the 3 senior board members he'd been working. No agenda was specified, which was itself the agenda. Ethan found out at dinner because Victoria told him at dinner now. That had become the rhythm. The day's difficult things got aired at the table after the girls had eaten and were occupied elsewhere in the window between cleared plates and the chaos of bedtime. It was Ethan had come to understand the most functional communication practice he'd had in any relationship in his adult life. "He wants to see us together," Victoria said. "Then let's go." She looked at him. "Ethan, I want you to understand this meeting could be hostile. Gerald has resources, and he has allies on the board, and he has been practicing this particular kind of institutional pressure for 40 years. He knows how to make people feel small." "I've been made to feel small before," Ethan said. "I got over it." "This is different. He'll go after the arrangement. He'll try to destabilize. What we have," Ethan said, and the steadiness in his voice surprised even him, "is not destabilizable. Not by Gerald Marsh." He met her eyes. "Let me be there. Let me be in the room." She looked at him the way she had the night in the library, that undefended look, the one that came when she'd stopped managing the moment and was just in it. "You don't have to do this," she said. "I know I don't have to," he said. "That's the point." The meeting was in Victoria's downtown office on a Tuesday morning. The building was the kind that had its own gravity glass and steel, and a lobby that suggested money without having to mention it. Ethan had been here once before briefly to meet Victoria's attorney. He hadn't been up to the executive floor. He was now. Marsh was already in the conference room with two other board members when they came in, a woman named Patricia Chen, who sat with the controlled posture of someone accustomed to being the most prepared person in any room, and a man named Douglas Webb who said nothing for the first 15 minutes and seemed to be cataloging everything. Marsh looked at Ethan the way he'd looked at him at the dinner, with the assessing pleasantness of a man who has already decided what he thinks and is now looking for confirmation. "Mr. Carter," he said, "good of you to join us." "I wouldn't miss it," Ethan said. He sat down beside Victoria and didn't adjust in his chair, didn't signal discomfort he didn't feel. Marsh laid it out directly, which Ethan respected even if he didn't appreciate it. He had questions about the timeline. He had questions about the speed of cohabitation. He had questions about the nature of the financial arrangement between Victoria and Ethan, which he framed as concern about conflict of interest, and which Ethan read accurately as an attempt to make the whole thing sound transactional and therefore suspect. Victoria answered each point with her customary precision. Dates, facts, documentation. She was extraordinary at this, the steady accumulation of evidence, the absolute refusal to be hurried or rattled. Then Marsh turned to Ethan and said, "I want to ask you something directly, man to man." "Go ahead," Ethan said. "What are you getting out of this?" The room was very quiet. Ethan looked at him. He thought about the eviction notice. He thought about Chloe's fever and the canceled calls. He thought about Sophia's arms around Victoria's shoulders in the kitchen 3 days ago. He thought about a woman in a library at midnight saying the most honest thing she'd ever said, and his hand finding hers in the space between their chairs. "I'll tell you exactly what I'm getting," he said. "My daughters have a home. They have stability they haven't had in 2 years. They have someone in their lives who shows up for them not because she's obligated to, not because it's in a contract, but because she chooses to every single day." He kept his voice level. "I'm getting a partner who is honest with me even when it costs her. I'm getting someone who cancels board calls when my 5-year-old has a fever. I'm getting a family Mr. Marsh." He paused. "I'm not sure what part of that you find suspicious." Marsh's expression didn't change. But Patricia Chen shifted slightly in her chair, and Douglas Webb, who had said nothing for 15 minutes, made a brief note on his legal pad. "The speed of it," Marsh said. "That's what concerns me. My wife died 18 months ago," Ethan said. "I've been the only thing standing between my daughters and the consequences of that loss. When something real comes along, when someone turns out to be the person you needed, without knowing you needed them, you don't take 6 months to decide. You decide." He leaned forward slightly. "I'd expect a man with your experience to understand that the things worth having don't always arrive on schedule." Marsh studied him. The measuring looked the same handshake as assessment quality now applied to everything Ethan had just said. Then Patricia Chen spoke for the first time. "I reviewed the statement you wrote," she said to Ethan. Her voice was direct, no warmth, but no hostility. "The one your legal team submitted in response to Gerald's inquiry." "Yes," Ethan said. "It was the most honest piece of communication I've received in connection with this board in 11 years. She looked at Victoria. "I've voted against you twice, Victoria. I want you to know that I'm reconsidering my position, not because of the dinner, not because of the arrangement." She looked back at Ethan. "Because this man wrote about you like someone who actually knows you, and in my experience, that's not something you can manufacture." Marsh opened his mouth. Chen cut him off. "Gerald, I think we have what we came for." Webb closed his legal pad. The meeting ended 20 minutes later. On the way to the elevator, Ethan said nothing. Victoria said nothing. They stood side by side while the doors opened, while the elevator descended, while the lobby resolved itself around them, and the glass doors let them out into the gray Seattle morning. On the sidewalk, she stopped. "Patricia Chen has never conceded anything in a meeting," she said. "In 11 years, not once." "She seemed like a person who responds to the truth," Ethan said. "She is." Victoria looked at him. "You knew that." "I read people," he said. "It's the only interesting part of the job." She looked at him for a moment with that expression he'd come to think of as the real one. The one underneath the CEO, underneath the composure, underneath the careful management of everything she'd learned to manage. Then she said quietly, "Thank you for being in that room." "Where else would I be?" he said. She didn't answer that, but the corner of her mouth moved, and he had learned by now to count that as everything. The board voted 6 weeks later. Victoria retained her position as CEO with a renewed mandate and a restructured leadership agreement that gave her expanded authority over strategic acquisitions, the very authority that Marsh had been working to limit. The vote was 7-2. Patricia Chen voted with the majority. Douglas Webb voted with the majority. Marsh voted against. Victoria told Ethan over breakfast. The girls were there. Sophia reading, Chloe engaged in the elaborate construction of a structure made from toast and jam that had no practical function but enormous architectural ambition. The morning was loud and warm and smelled like coffee and the slightly burnt edges that Chloe requested specifically. "It passed," Victoria said simply, setting down her phone. Ethan looked up. 7-2. 7-2. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held it. Across the table, Sophia looked up from her book and looked at their hands, and then looked back at her book without saying anything in the manner of a 7-year-old who has processed something and filed it correctly. Chloe's toast structure collapsed. "Daddy," she said mournfully. The bridge fell. "We'll rebuild it," he said. "Can Victoria help here?" Victoria looked at the collapsed architecture. She looked at Chloe's face. The theatrical devastation of it, the absolute commitment to the tragedy of a fallen toast bridge. Something in her expression did the thing it always did. Now came undone, gently remade itself into something that had no boardroom equivalent. Something that was only available here at this table, in this kitchen, in this loud and imperfect and irreplaceable morning. "Show me the design," she said. "We'll make it better than before." In April, they told the girls properly. They sat down together, all 4 of them, on the living room floor, which had been Chloe's suggestion, and which Victoria had agreed to without hesitation, and which Ethan had watched her lower herself to with the particular careful strength she never called attention to. They sat in a loose circle, and Ethan said with the directness he'd promised himself from the beginning, "We want to talk to you about what this family is." Sophia looked at him, then at Victoria. She was already thinking. "You know how this started," he said. "You know Victoria and I made an agreement, that we were going to try living together and see how it went." He paused. "It went better than I expected. Much better. And I want to be honest with you both, because you deserve honesty about where things are now. Chloe had her frog pajama top on, even though it was 2 in the afternoon. Are you in love? She asked immediately, with the directness of someone who has heard the word on enough TV shows to know it as a category. Ethan looked at Victoria. Victoria looked at Ethan. He thought about 30 days in a cafe. He thought about conditions and contracts and careful negotiations. He thought about midnight in a library and a hand that turned over and held his. He thought about what love looked like when it arrived not in a rush, but in the slow accumulation of chosen mornings, of showing up, of earning trust back from people who had every reason not to give it. Yes, he said. I think we are. Victoria looked at him when he said it. He looked back at her. Between them passed everything that the last 5 months had built, the whole quiet, stubborn, improbable architecture of it. And she held his gaze and didn't look away, and didn't put on the composure. She reached for when things became real, because she'd been practicing these 5 months at letting real things stay. I knew it, Chloe announced, satisfied. Sophia was quiet for a moment longer. Then she looked at Victoria. Are you going to stay? She asked. And in her voice was everything she didn't say, all the 7-year-old math of loss and hope, and the specific terror of loving something that might leave. Victoria looked at Sophia with the full steadiness of someone who has never made a promise she didn't keep. I'm going to stay, she said. That's not something I'm going to change my mind about. Sophia held her gaze, the long measuring look, the taking stock. Then she nodded. One decisive nod, the kind that closes a case. And then she climbed into Victoria's lap, not the spontaneous 5-year-old way, but deliberately choosing it, and put her head against her shoulder, and stayed there. Victoria's arms came around her. Ethan watched. He let himself watch. He let himself feel the full weight of it. Not the grief he'd been carrying for 18 months alongside everything else, but this. This thing that had grown in the space that grief had left, had filled it not by replacing what was gone, but by becoming something new. Something none of them had been looking for when they found it. Chloe crawled into his lap, and he held her and looked across the circle at Victoria, holding his other daughter, and thought with a clarity he hadn't felt since before Diane got sick. This is what I was holding it together for. This is the thing that needed me to keep going. 6 months after a rainy afternoon in a Seattle cafe, Ethan Carter stopped thinking of Victoria Hale's house as Victoria Hale's house. It happened without announcement. One morning he woke up and went downstairs and started making coffee, and realized, standing at the counter in the early quiet before the girls were up and the house was loud, that he felt home. Not like a guest who had been made comfortable. Not like a man executing the terms of an agreement. Home the way you feel it when it stops being a word and becomes something your body just knows. He heard her before he saw her, the soft sound of her chair in the hallway, the particular rhythm of her moving through the morning. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, the way she did now, unhurried, already thinking about something, her hair not yet arranged for the day. She had stopped performing composure for him somewhere around month 2. He was glad. He liked this version better, the real-time one, the unedited one. The one that was occasionally uncertain and sometimes had to sit with difficult things, and kept a child's sock on a staircase railing for 3 days because she didn't want to move it. You're up early, she said. Always, he said. Coffee, please. He handed her the cup. She took it the way she always did. Both hands a moment before drinking, like the warmth of it mattered as much as the caffeine. He had memorized this. He had memorized all of it, the way Sophia's book migrated through the house like a slow-moving creature, the way Chloe narrated everything she did as she did it, the way Victoria went still when something moved her and hoped nobody would notice, the way this kitchen smelled every morning, and the way the rain came back to Seattle like it belonged here. He had memorized this life the way you memorize things you intend to keep. The board wants a follow-up meeting, she said. When would next Thursday? I'll be there. She looked at him over her cup. You know you don't have to come to every Victoria, he said. She stopped. Where else would I be? He said. Same words as before. Same answer. The one that had become without either of them designing it their shorthand for everything the contract hadn't covered, and life had filled in anyway. She held his gaze. The corner of her mouth moved. He counted it as everything the way he always did. From upstairs came Chloe's voice, loud, immediate, fully committed to whatever emergency had just presented itself at 7 in the morning. Then Sophia's voice, lower, steadying. Then the twin thunder of small feet on the stairs, the specific joy of it, the sound that had turned a 12,000 square foot house into something that fit. Victoria turned toward the sound. He watched her face do what it always did, open ready there. This was what she had looked for in every boardroom and never found. This was what no acquisition, no quarterly return, no strategic victory had ever given her. Not the grand version of it that people put in speeches. The daily version, the real one. The one made of breakfast and homework and bad dreams and sick children and signed papers at a kitchen table, and a man who showed up not because a contract required it, but because he had decided somewhere along the way that this was where he belonged, and this was what Ethan had been building toward through every hard year. Not by looking for it, but by refusing to stop being the kind of man his daughters needed, until one rainy afternoon the world noticed and sent someone to meet him there. They had not come to each other easily. They had come carefully, honestly, through doubt and disclosure and the slow construction of trust between two people who had both been hurt by life in different ways, and had both decided separately and then together that the answer to having been hurt was not to stop opening. They stood together in their kitchen on an ordinary morning, waiting for their daughters to come downstairs, and the life they had made improbable, unconventional, real, in every way that mattered, settled around them like something that had always been there, waiting for them to be ready to live inside it. Some families are born, some are chosen. Some arrive on a rainy afternoon with 4 words and a business card, and the particular courage of 2 people willing to bet on something they can't quite name yet. This one was all 3, and it was exactly, completely, irrevocably enough.